Thank you, Margaret. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural Nielson Design Lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Honourable Andrew Fraser, the Treasurer and Minister for Employment and Economic Development, the State Librarian Leah Giles-Peters, Margaret Strello, Acting Chairperson for the State Library, Neil Roberts, President of the Queensland Library Foundation. We're very proud to partner the State Library to present this series of lectures by the international leaders in design field. It's an excellent opportunity to help drive the highest standards in designing Brisbane's future. Over the years, we at Nielson Properties have demonstrated our commitment to cutting-edge design, livability and environmental sustainability through our investments and support of innovative development in southeast Queensland. We take an active interest in improving the built and social structures within our city. We are strongly committed to design and the arts in Queensland with a long and successful relationship with the Australian Business Arts Foundation, known as ABAF, of which I'm a board member and currently the Queensland Chapter Chair. Our partnership with the State Library recognises the ongoing connection between arts, business districts in Brisbane via the dynamic North Quarter precinct. In fact, Nielson Properties and State Library literally face each other across the river and are only a short walk via the new Coralpa Bridge. Creativity in design shapes our lives every day, whether we're aware of it or not. Whether there's a way that people move about the city or the style in which people are housed. The design principles we apply play a strong role in determining the way in which people, businesses, communities interact and engage. Good design not only relates to aesthetics, but to functionality and to environmental sustainability. Our newest building, Santos Place, is Australia's newest 6-star energy-rated building and the only CBD tower in the country currently to achieve this standard of excellence. This building uses 1/3 of the energy of a standard size building, a similar size. This is equivalent to taking 1,600 cars a year off the road, which is quite a significant impact on our environmental and carbon footprint. Michael Sorkin's groundbreaking international and green approach complements the vision and ambition that South East Queensland has for its built environment, public spaces and its urban policies. Michael's argument that design and social engagement are totally connected and his special interest in city planning, green architecture, aligns with both the State Library and Nielson Properties design values. In our inaugural speaker, we have found the ideal person to initiate what we hope will be ongoing discussion among those with capacity and interest to shape the future of our city. I'd now like to invite our Deputy Premier, the Honourable Andrew Fraser, to introduce Michael Sorkin.
Thank you, Ross. Might I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather tonight? Can I acknowledge in particular Ross and Nielson Properties and other representatives here from Nielson Properties for their support of this evening, and also acknowledge representatives from the State Library here, Margaret Strello, Leah Giles-Peters and Neil Roberts. Tonight is important, ladies and gentlemen, for valuing design. Tonight's important for recognising that we should, as a state, value things more than we do at this point in time, that we should value the spark of energy that resides in people's minds, not just the energy that resides in our natural resources. Tonight's important for providing an opportunity to hear from a world-class view, a world-class opinion leader on important matters relating to the nature of our built form and our cities. Tonight's lecture is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which it sets an important benchmark for the 3 lecture series in having, as we do tonight, a world-class first lecturer and Professor Michael Sorkin, Professor of Architecture and Director of the Graduate Program in Urban Design of the City College of New York. As many of you in this room would appreciate, Professor Michael Sorkin is a world-famous thinker and world-famous leader in his field. He's conducted work around the world in Germany, in the Middle East, and most recently in Malaysia. He combines world-class strength in design, research and theory, along with an important voice exercised around the world on the nature of built form and of our urban design. The connection between design and social interaction is key amongst Professor Sorkin's views. As human beings, we are probably designed to interact. it is our inclination to interact with one another, but we oftentimes design physical surroundings that seem to hinder that inclination, that instinct to interact with one another. Tonight, amongst others, is a dissertation on the importance of the public space for that interaction as human beings, but it also provides space for an equally important commodity, equally undervalued, and that is the time for thoughtful reflection on these matters. Professor Sorkin is presently suffering a dreadful case of trans-Pacific jet lag, and he just mentioned to me that I should give the following introduction. Professor Michael Sorkin needs no introduction. Would you please welcome him to the stage?
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, librarians. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, audience. And thank you especially to the library. What a beautiful place this is. And to Nielson Properties for being so generous and so well organized. And thanks especially to Susan Kukushka, who's walking back, who collected me at 6 a.m. at the airport. This is above and beyond the call of any duty that I'm familiar with. There's been a slight misrepresentation. I'm not going to speak for 45 minutes. I feel that I am entitled to at least 1 minute for every hour that I will have to travel to and from this place. So I'm going to take an honest hour. Thank you very much. I do very few product endorsements, but the great Satan has come forth with the jet lag sufferer's friend here, so you'll excuse me if I indulge. At any rate, Stimulus Response, the title of my lecture. As the world has sunk into recession, governments across the planet have introduced stimulus packages in an attempt to prime their economic pumps and get capital flowing again. By stimulus, of course, what is meant is spending, and everyone takes some version of the Keynesian view. When the private sector fails, the government must step in to pull its chestnuts out of the fire. Public investment intended to get the wheels turning, get people back to work, give business breathing space to get its enfeebled act together. But getting the wheels turning is not an absolute good. It depends on which wheels get lubed. In the United States, there has been much talk of directing stimulus dollars to so-called shovel-ready projects, an approach that has mainly meant directing money at projects devoted to the repair of bridge and roadway infrastructure. And we have massively bailed out our ossified and stupid automobile industry. The people of the United States now have an 80% stake in General Motors, the world's largest corporation. Now, I'm all for socialism, but this is definitely not the way. What the stimulus package is actually stimulating is the reinforcement of a pattern of mobility that is killing us. Of course, the stimulus package is actually a response. We are spending money because the economy is sick in hopes of a cure. What we are not doing is using this money to further a more sustainable or logical vision of our future. And of course, we are canceling the advantage by the trillions wasted on warfare or thrown down the rat hole of bailouts for the banks. I don't mean to suggest that architecture and urbanism are the cures for our economic doldrums. I do mean to stipulate, however, that the planet is in deep need of reordering and repair, and that cities and architecture are key elements in getting this right. And more diffusely, I want to suggest that to understand our situation, architecture and urbanism must be read, that they are remarkably revealing of our patterns of collectivity and of consumption. This reading must take place at every level. Buildings directly contribute close to half of greenhouse emissions, and the increasingly dysfunctional pattern of the world's cities is killing us, body and soul. What I'd like to do in this talk is to articulate a series of principles that can act as stimuli for urbanism and building, and to show some responses from my own practice. What I hope to demonstrate is both that architecture and urbanism must observe a series of general principles for human pleasure and planetary survival, and that embedded in those precepts must be an idea of diversity, a crucial index of both physical and political health. We have, however, this may wind up to be a 2 or 3 Coca-Cola lecture, I warn you. We have, however, long been committed to both formal and ethical one-size-fits-all ideas, and have expended amazing amounts of violence and blind resolve to force this on other people. Whether crusaders or jihadis seeking to impose the one true faith, colonizers suppressing indigenous cultures with their civilizing mission, modernist architects with their international style, or today's corporate masters of the universe with their homogenizing Starbucks on every corner multinationalism, we have had a long experience with the ugly disciplinary side of principles that seek to perfect the species according to some unitary model. The task for us as designers and builders of cities is to find styles of successive reconciliation between what we must do on behalf of the collectivity of all species and where our private desires lead us. This compound and shifting territory should be the site for new authenticities that emerge from the interaction of memory and imagination. For example, we live at a time of dramatic cultural change and clash, and the problem of preserving authentic forms of cultural habit and expression is vexed. Too many are convinced that cultural authenticity can be maintained via simple mimicry, through the reproduction of historic forms of architecture and urbanism that have been completely wrested from their originating contexts, from the actual sources of meaning. By living in Mektara, we become Scarlett O'Hara. Not. In the U.S., we are particularly beleaguered by the success of the so-called new urbanists, who mix sensible ideas about scale and movement with a dogmatic commitment to a historicized architecture of oppressive correctness. In doing so, they ignore the multiplicity of publics, the dramatic changes in the structures of affinity and lifestyle that characterize contemporary society, and the fact that experiment, change, accident, and unpredictability are core values for both the city and for our culture more generally. The hammerlock of nostalgia has an enormous capacity to imprison, a point well observed in the film The Truman Show, set in one of the best-known new urbanist communities, or tellingly in that old TV series, The Prisoner, itself set in the fantasy space of Port Merion, one of the key new urbanist antecedents. That great theorist of urbanity, Henri Lefebvre, wrote of a right to the city. By this he meant, of course, a conventional right of access to and use of the range of spaces and opportunities the city has to offer. More crucially, however, he was asserting that each of us possesses the right to imagine the city of his or her desires. Since such desires are constantly and singularly being invented and changed, this means that the final form and behavior of the city must always remain open. Now, I've spoken high-mindedly about principles, and I'd like to offer some that I think should guide the future of the city. These are frankly utopian in character, in that they represent an aspiration to something universal. There's obvious danger here, and there are reasons why the idea of utopia has come in for such a remarkably bad rap, and now almost uniformly constitutes a term of derision. When we hear the word utopia, many reach for their revolvers, repelled either by a kind of dreamy, hippy-dippy airiness or something far more sinister, the repressions of totalitarianism, the condition of universal subjectivity and centralized control. For many, the inevitable omega point of utopian thinking is Auschwitz. Architects and planners have been deeply implicated in this dream of uniformity and the high-minded suppression of difference. Modernist urbanism, which continues to haunt the planet, was proposed as a kind of liberation, but now has become a touchstone for dystopianism. Our current nightmare is bifold. On the one hand, the soul-deadening uniformity of the projects, and on the other, the darkly disordered and dysfunctional world of out-of-control megacities and sprawl, concentration camps for otherness, alien nations like those depicted in Blade Runner or District 9. The sorry consequence of this anxiety is that we have too much denied ourselves the necessary and useful habits of thinking big. But that's the scale of the crisis, and we cannot surrender the possibility and the practice of attempting to confront it comprehensively and on every front. If we have learned nothing else from our increased awareness of ecology, it is that we live in a world of complex interdependencies, a place of innumerable, elastic, shifting, and overlapping boundaries. We can only deal with our planetary crisis if we establish a rational and flexible dialectic that permits us to simultaneously model the local and the global, to help structure their necessary interaction. We must, however, stay cognizant of the difference between a fantasy and a regulation. Fantasies must have no boundaries if they are to do their duty in stoking the engines of creativity and justice both. So to take some of the sting out of the worrisome side of conventional utopias, I resort to an orthographic dodge and adopt the spelling pioneered by Patrick Geddes, utopia with an E. Although that prefix does have a mixed background, most of us are better disposed to euphoria than to eugenics, I mean to recapture its original meaning and now offer some foundational principles for making simply better places. The situation is acute, and not simply because the environment is going to hell in a handbasket. One of the reasons we must re-legitimate and expand the discourse of the city, understood as a whole, is that we simply need new cities. Today, more than half the planet, close to 3.5 billion people, live in cities, and by the year 2050, 70% of us will. Half of these people live in slums, and we are currently adding to the urban population at the rate of 1 million people a week. That's 50 Brisbanes a year just to keep up with growth. If we are going to deal with the scourge of sprawl, new cities must be part of the answer. So too, of course, the reimagination, refinement, and responsibility of our existing cities, the artful and sustainable management of their evolution and growth. Now, I've been refining a kind of manifesto about the key qualities of these cities for years, and it's now grown to 12 principles, each of which I will briefly illustrate with a project or two in a series of graphic interludes after I declaim each principle in appropriately stentorian tones. Because of a horrible experience I had with a lecture in Melbourne many years ago when, speaking from notes, I was overcome with a jet lag so monumental I was unable to continue, I have chosen, contrary to my usual style, to write out tonight's talk, thank God, in confidence that even if I find myself unable to think, I should still be able to read. Herewith, then, a manifesto. Number 1, strictly neutral. How do you measure sustainability? Of course, by keeping strict accounts of inputs and outputs. But against what standard? I begin with a utopian impossibility, an end state never to be achieved, but still to be constantly measured. The economic model that most closely describes the mechanism of urban self-sufficiency is that of import replacement. In her classic, The Economy of Cities, Jane Jacobs argues that this process has been the historic driver of rapid urban growth and differentiation from the very earliest days of cities. Although generally used to describe a strictly economic dynamic, the idea also contains a teleological component. It begs the question of why cities grow and implicitly contains a notion about the limits of growth. This balance between political autonomy and environmental self-sufficiency has a clear vector of scale. And once again, the only reasonable solution to unchecked growth is to create new cities, and lots of them. Of course, this process is effectively taking place all the time, and answers to no designer but the invisible hand, which of course can only draw the bottom line. The default is simply the undisciplined growth of existing towns, coalescing in the global spread of the interstitial ooze of edge city sprawl. My country leads the way. The American economy directs the majority of urban investment and development not to traditional urban centers, but to the endless periphery of the multinational globopolis, producing a new kind of distributed space that owes its fealty only to capital and places its colonizing fragments in yielding territories from Omaha to Bangalore to Surfer's Paradise. Utopian urbanism seeks the neutrality of going it alone. The goal of urban self-sufficiency, of urban neutrality, in the same sense that we say carbon neutrality, is to provide a primary measure of a city's responsiveness to the biosphere and an inventory of global economic and environmental justice. A city striving to support itself will, via this predicate of economy, find a more meaningful and defensible place in a world community increasingly characterized by weak states and powerful corporations. Equally crucial, the self-sufficient metropolis will limit its growth by harmonizing its production with the bearing capacity of its site and the desires of its population. Economies of scale are not based on an ever-increasing gyre of size. True economy is a proportioning system, a means of balancing needs, wants, and resources. The self-sufficient city will find the medium of its own singularity by evolving an economy that does not simply reproduce a universal pattern of supply and demand based on the corporate invention of want, but that engenders forms that incorporate historic habits, desires, and uses. It will specialize both for competitive advantage and self-identity, and because of the depth of its internal economy, promote welfare and exchange among its citizens. And it will be ever open to question. In a little project that my NGO called Terraform has been working on for several years, called New York City Steady State, we are investigating the possibility that New York City might become completely self-sufficient within the boundaries of the 5 boroughs, that its ecological footprint can become fully coterminous with its political one. Although at the margins, this will involve some substantial adjustments in lifestyle, kiss coffee and steak goodbye, we have found many of the respiratory functions of the city to be surprisingly tractable. Food, water, energy, air quality, waste, building, and movement have all yielded to this autonomy regime without resort to exotic, over-the-horizon technologies. What we hope to demonstrate via this project is the great distance cities might move in taking responsibility for their own planetary behavior, dramatically improving their environmental neutrality and enhancing their own freedom. And by compiling a catalog of technologies and their effects on the form of the city, we want to show that progress can be made in sustainable increments. Limited. The debate over compact, bounded cities needs to be continued vigorously. But bounding is, I believe, still crucial. A primary agenda for any urban growth is the retention of the difference between what is urban and what is not, a proposition about both character and edges. While we may prefer to think of nature as an artifact, a kind of pet-like remnant of rationalist ideology, the continued existence of the natural environment is crucial for both our psychical and our physical survival. The only cure for sprawl is to call a halt to it, to build cities in which boundaries are clear, cities that are able to continuously inventory the means of their own survival, differentiation, hospitality, and assets. This will produce a double cycle of growth. The first phase, that of enlargement, will limit the expanded territorial requirements of the city. The second, characteristic of historic cities, like this one, will be an ongoing differentiation in place. As cities mature and become successful, this differentiation will devolve on a set of shrinking physical sites, resulting in the continuous growth of complexity rather than of extent. In the democratic city, this will be provided by both an accumulation of consent and by an interrogation by dissent, an opposition that will serve to limit the ease of involuntary transformation, favoring the most widespread and differing styles of compact, rather than the autocracy of the top-down or the emptiness of predigested choices. In proposals for new towns in Riva, Turkey, on the Black Sea, Chungcheong, Korea, a city of 500,000, and Hinhap, Laos, we have fixed urban edges with clarity. As suggested, this is not meant to thwart change, but to fix physical limits for territorial expansion. We urgently need to create cities that can live within their means, and this argues that the possibility of continuous low density but high environmental cost engorgement of the urban periphery must cease. The logic of urban growth must incorporate a theory of limits that takes into account both the bearing capacity of site and the strains on governance, organization, and life that come with cities grown too fat to walk. We have good evidence, too, that suburbanism is disproportionately expensive financially, that infrastructure costs per capita are much higher than in town, that efficient public transportation, you see the light at last, that efficient public transportation is prohibitive, and that the supporting car culture is a source of many of the epidemic diseases of the era, including obesity, diabetes, and alienation. Open. Control of this. Free access is the precondition of free assembly, the most important manifestation of democracy in space. Open cities imply that the structure of their internal differences will not prohibit free movement within them, nor the exercise of free choice by their citizens about where to live or how to be. The open city, whatever its physical limits, will be founded on hospitality, on a willingness to accommodate difference, and to welcome outsiders. Of course, such cities cannot survive without a reciprocal willingness by other cities to incorporate similar freedoms, and without a global effort to ensure that all cities find their fair shares of the world's wealth. The vast army of refugees and migrants that mark the modern world is produced by a globalization in which the greatest mobility belongs to capital, which enjoys a circuit of choice born of unfettered opportunism sustained by radical inequality. Open cities will offer people their own free choices based on desire, not coercion or desperation. The open city will also be a place in which the bounding membrane is permeable to nature, the famous Copenhagen plan. The hard edge of growth will extend only to the spread of the inorganic outwards, not to the penetration of the natural environment inwards, or to the accessibility of the not city to those who live in the city itself. For them, the horizon will always be dual, offering both the opportunity to plunge deeper into the urban labyrinth or to find an easy track out of it. No particular form, whether the grid, the cluster, the corridor, or the gradient, holds any special authority here. All must ultimately be judged not by their intention, but by their effects. Finally, the utopian city will move beyond the historic strictures of zoning to a far more open planning format. Zoning arose as an instrument for segregating obnoxious uses and dangerous people, and as a means for making the functional organization of the city more legible. As the world moves, however, unevenly to more benign forms of manufacture, as the digital revolution offers individuals greater freedom of choice about where to be, and as we cease hating our neighbor for her color, culture, or class, the city can become more like a loft, ready to adaptably accommodate a legion of differences, choices, refusals, and eccentricities anywhere. The open city will be one of endlessly refreshed juxtapositions. Of course, this happy picture takes as its unassailable predicate a reversion of control to the people, the end of involuntary mobility, the defeat of manufactured consent, the purity of tolerance, and the eternal power of dissent. The imaginary city of Weed, Arizona, was an early experiment in the form of a loft city. The basic premise is that it is possible to design a city to a high level of formal specificity without precise foreknowledge of how exactly it will be occupied. The loft, in my way of thinking, is a kind of architectural stem cell, capable of producing a wide variety of use spaces. Its basic dimensions are established by reference to the body, by the need to give everyone access to light and air, by questions of orientation and ventilation, by a sense of scale, and by tactics of aggregation. These drawings and model, if perhaps a bit on the wild side, are indeed to scale, and you'll recognize the presence of staircases, openings, and other basic architectural elements. Although few uses are precisely specified, the drawings do offer a proposition about variety and difference. I can't say precisely what the various green areas in this image represent: gardens, farms, bioremediation zones, playgrounds, but they do suggest a particular density of variation. Of course, no city can be completely without assigned uses, and this image represents a central place, surrounded by several theaters, clearly a place likely to concentrate cultural and leisure uses. It's the South Bank of Weed, Arizona. Weed is perhaps insanely complex, but does attempt to suborn the complexity to the invention of possibility. The root idea contradicts received wisdom about flexibility that suggests that the most flexible spaces are the least differentiated, that subdivision should be the medium of flexibility. In a city that is structured like a loft, one in which anything can be anywhere, I would argue, hint of things to come, I would argue that the best strategy for flexibility is aggregation, that a series of human-scaled, somewhat resistant spaces be combined to yield new uses. Weed represents an argument for an incremental, combinatory approach to urbanism, a reproach to the Cartesian style that still so dominates our urban thinking today. Body-based. Green urbanism, utopia, sees cities as habitats. Placing and maintaining ourselves in healthy environments is central to its task. There is indeed some holy writ here. Whatever the augmenting mix, self-propulsion has priority. Setting aside the current utopian horizon, that's with a U, eternal life and perfect health, the utopian city will strive to accommodate and comfort all sorts of bodies and will privilege human locomotion as the source of its mobility and bodily comfort as the source of its dimensions. City air makes you free, as the stirring motto of the Hanseatic League had it, but only if you can get a breath. The walking city ramifies directly in its architecture. Easy accessibility mainly generates an architecture that is low. Now, I've lived on the 5th floor of a walk-up apartment building for over 25 years, and my extensive empirical research has revealed that this is the natural limit for stair climbing on a regular basis, at any rate by middle-aged Americans. Parenthetically, weed is uniformly 5 stories and below. We can be precise about the dimensions of the sustainable loft city in both plan and section. The modernist might say that the exercise of mobility in both horizontal and vertical axes is crucial to the health of the organism, but only achieves this mobility via an alienating sequence of encapsulations. Elevator to automobile to elevator to automobile to whatever. Messages that urge us to buy a vehicle and start driving. Patterns that offer no alternative but the automobile. The growing predominance of the elevator high-rise. Even the fantasy of the infinite reparability of our bodies through drugs, surgery, or other centrally administered forms of self-help all contribute to the marginalization of the body as a driver of form. Unless it is restored to the center, architecture is dead. The Shrooms project proposes a prototypical, if slightly wacky, loft building that is designed to grow on a series of vacant lots within an existing Brooklyn neighborhood. The buildings, as a system, are meant to initiate a new pedestrian network at both grade and roof level to supplement the existing grid. The buildings themselves are formed around a central social space that might also serve as a site for common respiratory processes, including a living machine for treating liquid wastes, a recycling and repair center, a greenhouse, and a thermal management system. Vertical services are concentrated in a core that unfolds in a series of leaves or pods of unspecified use. Our project for Arverne, Queens, not far away from the Shrooms, is also based on a low-rise prototype, in this case, a 3-story, 12-unit building. Like the Shrooms, these are organized around a central greenhouse space, oriented to the southern sun to serve collective and environmental uses. The units are more conventional apartments, and the variation in the twist of each building is to assure that at least one room in each enjoys a view of the nearby Atlantic. The individual buildings aggregate in a series of superblocks, which are free of cars and form a green recreational zone in which children can roam unhindered by traffic. The superblocks themselves are aggregated in 2 halves and are surrounded by an enclosure of special use buildings, workplaces, commerce, hotels, and so on. The whole of the project is organized around a central axis produced by a typical New York City miracle, a subway station that faces a beautiful beach. Diverse. As I've already mentioned, most U.S. households already live in non-nuclear family arrangements. As our affinities become more increasingly elective and our lifestyles more diverse, our urban architecture must accommodate a broadening range of choices. We rely on our environments not simply to reflect the reality of our desires, but to authenticate our differences. This implies a city of numerous good, expanding, and tractable choices. A city that extends tolerance to the point of celebration. The goal of architecture is happiness, but our pleasure must not be purchased at someone else's expense. The utopian city has no tolerance for the ghetto. The post-zoning loft city will be especially adept at the push-pull of local transformations that will allow diversity to flourish without exclusion. Its boundaries will be both flexible and creative, ecotones, not walls, places where the mingling of desires and expressions will constantly produce new ones. This is not some fantasy of an impossible future, but the reflection of a reality that already exceeds our ability to house it. A large project for Penang in Malaysia approaches diversity in a more instrumental fashion. The scheme is for something over 2,500 housing units, and again, they are organized primarily in a single high-rise building type, although the plan also includes low-rise areas to elide with the character of surrounding neighborhoods. The project is designed to achieve a high degree of respiratory autonomy via a series of passive strategies to reduce cooling loads, self-sufficiency in energy production, on-site water harvesting and liquid waste remediation, an internal transport system to keep cars at the periphery, and a series of other measures. But the project also seeks a kind of social harmonization or neutrality. By this I mean that it attempts to provide all of the necessities of daily life within easy walking compass of home, the very definition of a neighborhood. Thus, the site provides enough shops, commerce, recreation, schools, clinics, cultural facilities, workplaces, and so on to support its population. While it's clear that as a practical matter, it's unlikely that everyone who lives in the community would work there, go to school there, or take their leisure there, and while I am not arguing for a city of impermeable enclaves, it does seem to me that the idea of local autonomy that I've already discussed at the urban scale is one that should also be modeled at the scale of the neighborhood, the block, the building, and even the unit. A product of this striving for autonomy will necessarily be diversity, the foundation of environmental and social resilience. Neighborly. The idea of the neighborhood bridges the Athenian and medieval ideas of the commune with that of the metropolis. The neighborhood is the fundamental increment of urban social and formal organization and the medium of urban propinquity. If walking is the alpha means of urban circulation, then the basic construct of urban organization, the neighborhood, will be both sized and differenced to accommodate people on foot. This suggests that neighborhoods should be highly mixed in use, supporting the range of daily necessities, as I've mentioned, employment, education, commerce, conviviality, that are crucial to full and active life. The legibility and tractability of the neighborhood is also central to the spread of a democratic polity. Urban politics is not simply about a site, but also a condition. And neighborhoods are essential to the creation of human autonomy and the birthplaces of urban sociability. If we are to fully participate in the life of the planet, we must have the right to control our bodies and our homes, and the right to participate in the management of our immediate environments. Good neighborhoods make this immediacy clear, and by investing them with rich possibilities, we help to offer the deep choices that give meaning to collective decisions. Neighborhoods, whether in my own Greenwich Village, Vallingby, or Victoria, are the foundations for neighborliness, the greatest virtue in the repertoire of urban citizenship, the core of global civility. That these bonds are produced even under the worst physical adversities is a testament to their abiding importance. The real struggle for neighborhoods, though, is in finding the means for them to be non-exclusionary. A neighborhood can be defined in many ways, and real neighborhoods come into existence via the tightening of social bonds and the elaboration of economic relations, not via a minimal inventory of elements, like those modernist so-called neighborhood units, with their carefully calculated minima of housing types, parking spaces, schools, sports fields, and shopping centers. Nevertheless, it's crucial that the design of new towns and cities conduce the possibility for neighborhoods to materialize from the formal structures laid down and to achieve the kind of harmonies I've just been describing. In that Chungcheong project in Korea, which was planned only at the very large scale, we designed for the emergence of neighborhoods via several separate undertakings. First, we zoned for a series of centers that produced interlocking walking radii of about 10 minutes. We coordinated these centers with density, assuring that an increment of 10,000 people produced some sense of locality. Finally, and this is backwards, we described a series of shifts of materiality and physical character, all riffing on some aspect of a familiar place that would help create a texture of visual and morphological difference to produce different styles of inhabitation. In two imaginary cities, Weed and Eurasia, neighborhoods are suggested by distance, distinction, and compaction. In Weed, the neighborhoods might emerge from the highly delimited urban boundary, from a series of lateral spines that clearly bound place, and from a high degree of figurality. In Eurasia, here, the neighborhoods feel much more like villages and are intended for a population coming into town from the countryside, which would have access to extensive green space for the private cultivation of food. Many-centered. As I've suggested, public assembly is foundational for both democracy and sociability. Facilitating such gatherings is perhaps our most critical task as designers, and the measure of such interactions our most useful index of urban success. We have increasing difficulty speaking of public space, both because of the surge of privatization, the global flood of gated communities, shopping malls, and theme parks, and because of a suspicion of traditional physical forms, the streets and squares, the parks and cafes of historic urbanism, as anathema to our new multiplicity. Such places, however, are bulwarks for the expression of our rights and still strong symbols for the meaning of collectivity. The bodily right of access is fundamental and is guaranteed by the spaces that we set aside as public. Indeed, the humanity of the city can be measured in part by the character and the care reflected in such spaces. The good city reflects an accumulation of social compacts about how to use it and about how to be urban. Strolling the plaza at sunset, sipping tea as the world passes by, picking up a team for soccer in the park, skateboarding under the highway. All of these are the treasures of urbanity, and displacing them in the name of innovation or security is both stupid and pernicious. Although netizenship and other forms of virtual adjacency are great means for augmenting our relations around the planet, for organizing affinities that transcend our immediate environments, we abandon the face-to-face at our peril. Being green means recognizing the pattern of our own sociability. It is not simply a distraction from what might seem more pressing principles, but a crucial rearticulation of the terms of political argument for managing a globalizing culture. To the degree that the ownership of the urban and natural environment, and America and its ideological allies are pressing for a rapid devolution of the global commons into private hands, indexes the word distribution of wealth, its stewardship becomes the marker of what was once called class struggle. However, equally crucial to the character of the Green City, which I understand to be conceptually fully interchangeable with the idea of the just city, is the way in which it fulfills the primal role of democratic space, providing the setting for both the deliberate and the accidental meeting of people and places. In thinking about public space, it is crucial to remember both that we live in a world of multiple publics and that the skateboarder and the cappuccino drinker use the city differently. This, however, does not mean that we should reject the spaces of public sociability that have evolved so successfully over the centuries, those streets and squares, those souks and parks. Our repertoire needs to be expanded, not contracted or radically altered, and as architects and urbanists, we have a special responsibility to assure that public space remains the site of physical encounters. For an urban hub in the South Bronx, we attempted to center a district on a kind of miniature Times Square. By rationalizing circulation and connections to transit, adding space for gathering, and constructing this media wall, we hope to create an imageable attractor and a strong and useful sense of place identity. In a couple of ancient competition designs for Berlin, our effort was to create a series of gathering spaces at very different scales and in different moods and registers in order to accommodate gatherings and activities of many different types and to thwart efficient surveillance and control of the crowds. After 9/11, We did a number of projects for Ground Zero, each predicated on the idea that the space should remain exceptional, not return to business as usual. It seemed that the best riposte to terror was an excess of democracy, and that democracy's primary spatial embodiment is free assembly. New York, as it turns out, is a city that lacks a great public square. We have no Tiananmen, Zocalo, or Trafalgar for mass gatherings. Our nearest equivalent, Times Square, has until recently only been available exceptionally when cars are banned on New Year's Eve. We proposed repeatedly that Ground Zero become such a place of free public gathering. Complex. The city is a propinquity engine, a means of organizing the encounter of bodies in space. Creativity and democracy both thrive on the accidental, on the unexpected and continuous enlargement of possibilities. The city must be filled with useful margins and edges, with those human ecotones, rich sites of interaction between neighboring ecologies that permit the growth of differentiation and complexity. The good city is marked not simply by the wealth of its choices, but by both the efficient and unexpected means of discovering them. The production of such accidents depends, to a degree, on our ability to get lost in the city. This is not an absolute value. Cities should not be places of fear, nor is every accident a happy one. One does not wish to be struck by a car or meet one's ex-wife every time one sets out to take a walk. There's a clear distinction between what might be called traditional forms of urban confusion, the result of complexity, irregularity, and unpredictable changes, and more modern forms, based on the alienations of indifference, on the confusion that springs from too much sameness. Indeed, this modern style of equality, in which our rights are identified with the surrender of all those features that make us and our environments unique, the melting pot, as it were, is a great enemy of true freedom. Freedom based on the enrichment of choice via our own power to choose and invent. Expanding and critiquing the field of good choices is at the core of our duty, not simply as architects and urbanists, but as democratic citizens and as good neighbors. A project for the Jiabei district of Shanghai, between the northern train station and the Suzhou Creek, made two demands, both, I think, quite relevant for Brisbane. The first was the reclamation of the river's edge, which was derelict, disused, and inaccessible. The second was to counter the general direction of development, which was completely wiping out the intimate, small-scale texture of the place, replacing an intricate pattern of winding streets and lanes with a series of ever larger superblocks and monster avenues. Although there was no way of preserving the diminutive building fabric, we did introduce a fine-grained infrastructure of circulation, including extensive pedestrian and cycling routes, and a fabric of connected open spaces in order to prevent future building that would exceed a humane scale. We created a special sense of place for the waterfront and also proposed that new building take on a consistent character that would represent design of a high degree of sustainability. Taste came in here, specific my own Jones for places like Guilin and Halong Bay, for a particular breed of architectonic mountains, and these are mountains to the precise required FAR of the site, an image that's long been a fixation of Chinese painting. Another waterfront, this time in Lower Manhattan, was one we proposed polemically as an alternative to a proposal we thought was too tepid. New York has over 600 miles of waterfront, and most of it seems to fall in its redevelopment into one of two categories. Either a kind of Olmstedian park, a la Riverside, or else some version of Battery Park City, big buildings flanking a promenade. Well, there's nothing exactly meretricious about either of these. I think they hardly exhaust the possibilities. Our scheme had a few predicates. First, the understanding that a waterfront is not a seam, but a gradient. A wash of conditions that extends from terra firma to wetlands, to pilings, to floating objects, and so on. Reciprocally, this means that the influence of the waterfront extends deep inland, and our scheme probes many blocks into the city. There's a long history behind this project, beginning specifically in the 1920s, when the waterfront was still dominated by shipping, and the city built an elevated highway that extended from 59th Street all the way to the Battery. And I remember this very well from my childhood, driving with my father and intoxicated by the alternating rhythm of pier and ship and pier and ship and pier and ship, all observable from the highway above. In the late 1970s, however, a hapless truck driver was making his way along the highway when his truck fell through. Turned out the thing was rusted, rotten, and immediately closed. There followed an insane debate about what to do, and the proposition that emerged was something called Westway, a humongous 10-lane interstate highway that was to be buried in a landfill that would extend 800 feet into the Hudson from the bulkhead to the pierhead line. The thing was idiotic at every level, but it had two strong constituencies. Developers, for whom this vast territory would have been a bonanza, and municipal officials entranced by the 90% financing available from the federal government, a stimulus that has, over the years, led city after city in America to commit harikiri, disemboweling themselves for the cash. At the end of the day, the thing was defeated by an environmental lawsuit on behalf of the striped bass population of the river, who, it seemed, used the tiling under the piers as their breeding ground. And the finest line delivered as the project went down in flames was spoken by our beloved ex-mayor, Ed Koch, a strong Westway supporter who reportedly said, "If those striped bass need a place to fuck, I will build them a motel in Peekskill, an unattractive town upriver." Our scheme incorporates the so-called boulevard, also 10 lanes wide, that emerged as a compromise, and we have tried for a more lively, mixed-use waterfront that extends its tendrils to inshore neighborhoods. Most crucially, though, we've added a public transportation component to the scheme, completely missing from what the city has now built. By snipping off, and I am green with envy at the catamaran service that you have on your river. By snipping off the inboard ends of existing piers and adding bridges with a mild camber, we discovered that water buses could easily cruise along the shoreline, shopping to disgorge passengers for transfer to landside means of movement. Local. First, the weight of culture and history, the fabric of memory and consent, must be served. This, as I said, does not mean the limp conservation of historic forms. Rather, it means that forms and habits that remain vital are reproduced and that living textures are reused. The second source is responsiveness to the bioclimatic particulars of place. These are the emergent morphologies of green urbanism, and their unfolding will be the most dramatic and important source of physical transformations of the city. Here, though, best practices will emerge regionally, and there will be strong logics for repetition. Many of both the technical and formal defaults for these newly imagined cities will become widespread. Urban singularity, the unique identity of Venice or Fez, Paris or New York, Istanbul or Sana, is not automatic or natural. In the utopian city, to preserve and legitimate difference, we must increasingly rely on artistic invention to set the terms of urban identity. And why not? We have arrived at a moment in which the design of cities can be dramatically re-engaged as a discourse of the harmonization of the received with the freshly imagined. It is possible to speculate about forms that are both logical and have never been seen before. This is a core task for Utopia. In a project for a community group in East New York, Brooklyn, we were confronted with a very poor community that was rich in two resources: a vast number of derelict vacant lots and a strong interest in local agriculture. It lacked, however, any sense of center and had little cogency. The place was ragged and collective functions distributed too widely along a surface of street space. Our clients asked for a vision, and we began to draw. We're strong believers in an approach to urbanism that combines both inductive and deductive styles of working, and disbelieve in the spurious rationality that often comes via overly rigorous programming that precedes and constrains the plunge of invention. So we drew Marcel Marceau style, feeling our way around the site, allowing new-built green and blue elements to enter and swim about, seeking out space and form. At the end of the day, we did have this lovely drawing, but it was not exactly one that we felt comfortable showing the client. And so we began to think about a more minimal proposal that would leverage a transformation to a condition that we, at that point, did not yet clearly see. The idea that we came up with was a kind of acupuncture, planting a single tree in an intersection. Well, as it turned out, this clarified things remarkably and allowed us to produce the next drawing, which gave precision to the idea. By blocking traffic, the trees would produce spaces of calm around them, which would allow the creation of lower density, semi-agrarian neighborhoods that seemed to be part of the dream of many there. But the real discovery was that this selective reduction in density would be able to conduce a dramatic increase in density nearby, creating the kind of traditional mixed-use urban centers that the area so desperately lacked. Appropriate technology, and for those of you keeping count at home, there are 12 points. We can keep loving technology. A Kindle can save a copse. But it is time to move on from the giant energy model. Technology is refreshing itself at an astonishing rate, but we're coming up short with applications and cost benefits, and too often cannot answer the question of why we bother. Appropriate technologies of sustainability will be foundational in the disposition of the elements of the city and in their particular configuration. The repertoire of shading, insulating, managing wind, using indigenous materials, carefully considering life cycle from cradle to cradle, reducing embodied energy in construction, incorporating renewable means of creating electrical energy, all will contribute to the formulation of an architecture of particularity and suitability within the larger context of local wishes and memories, demands, and perplexities. This imaginary town was created on commission at the time of the millennium for a magazine that asked us to speculate about the retirement community of the future. Understanding that it was my own boomer generation that was the object of this exercise, I assumed that retirement was a complete fiction, and we created instead a small town, although it does include an enormous golf course. Like our other projective urban projects, this one obliges residents to leave their cars on the periphery and proceed by more benign means. The whole is divided into a series of village clusters, and there is a uniform row house building type throughout. Each unit has a south-facing greenhouse, and each row shares a living machine for bioremediation of wastes and the introduction of a greywater cycle. The houses themselves are constructed of a soy-derived plastic, a renewable material with the added advantage that, should the Social Security check arrive a little late for the retirees, the living room wall can be eaten. In the street out front, you can see the preferred means of internal movement, a hierarchy that begins with people on foot. We've also drawn a generic bubble car, the kind of soft, non-emitting, slow-moving, unaggressive vehicle that we think should mark the movement particle of the future. Cities have, for too long, been obliged to play a devastating game of catch-up with movement systems designed with no love for them, and have undergone massive distortions with the introduction of the railroad and the car. It is time to focus on the design of vehicles and movement systems that will actually produce the kinds of cities that we desire. Green. This is literal. The utopian city will be green and active. we will surely be thrilled by the marriage of new and historical knowledge about sustainability in the gestation of forms for utopian cities. Buildings will be shaped for sun and air, wastes remediated at every scale, toxins removed, propinquities engendered and shifted, conventions refined, fresh climaxes, I mean this in the forestry sense, of course, fresh climaxes achieved, compacts agreed or denied, and precedents and models will be attended to, including earlier runs at utopia. Among these will surely be the Garden City, which to its endless credit sought self-sufficiency, compact dimension, human scale, and a kind of proto-environmentalism that reflected the rapid rise of the natural sciences and the first stirrings of global ecology in the 19th century. The salient characteristic of the Garden City, though, was that it was green. Garden cities were an early effort to address what was perceived as a dramatic imbalance in human relations with the natural world. Just as contemporary Darwinism resituated the species within the family of worldly creatures and dealt a mortal blow to received ideas of human exceptionalism, so the protagonists of the Garden City and successors, like Patrick Geddes, redescribed urbanism as a sheltering activity with a predominantly biological basis. The opening up of the city to an idea of necessary cohabitation with the plant and animal kingdoms produced a new morphology of inclusion, derived from a fantasy of the balance represented by the village life of a previous age. This restoration of the putatively superior social principles of small town and village life was to be advanced not simply by a turning back, but by new technologies of movement and communication that allowed the Garden City not simply to be scaled up from a village model, but also networked with a hoped-for galaxy of new towns of similar character, with abundant green space in between. We still have much to learn, not simply from the example of these propositions, but also from the way in which the ideas of the Garden City have been twisted and degenerated as they've morphed into vapid suburbanism and one-dimensional visions of new towns, too simple, too monochrome, too unquestioning. The lesson of these places in this movement, however, must be redirected. The creation of new towns is not opposed to the idea of the big city in general. Big cities remain central to the human project and unique in their ability to deliver lives of richness, confusion, and diversity. Rather, the idea of the Garden City must be reapplied to its own bastion, suburban sprawl, the real nemesis of urban and planetary sustainability. Our new and newly green cities will owe a great deal to this earlier project, and not just in the terms suggested above. If one can make a blanketing statement about the character of these cities, it is that they will literally teem with green. This proposition might seem both too obvious and too simple, but an abundance of plant life in cities will mark their efficiency and progress in the future and color our new global environmental consciousness. For virtually every issue cities confront, nature has an answer. Our new urban gardens, ubiquitous on every horizon, will supply us with oxygen, absorb pollution, control temperatures, provide habitat for our fellow creatures, offer us food, grow our construction materials, calm our gaze, and instrumentalize our autonomy. This condition must become the default. Our lives depend on it, on remembering something we've always known, but must learn again. Our design for that new city on the Black Sea, Istanbul, was certainly informed by the Garden City paradigm. It is strictly delimited and surrounded by a protected green belt, by a river, and by the sea. The scheme incorporates both a small existing village as well as a number of areas where single-family homes of mediocre quality have been built, mainly as summer residences. Like other projects we have done, this one was greatly compromised by constraints of prior planning and patterns of ownership. Divided among a number of major developers, all of whom insisted on equal treatment of their parcels and would not entertain any discussion of swapping or compromise, a site that might have been better designed with greater consolidation and density became a series of linked villages that cover most of the site. They are, however, relieved by a green core and periphery and by extensive green interconnection. True to our general principles, the town is designed in the spirit of harmonization and provides for most of its respiratory functions within its boundaries. Each of the villages is keyed to a particular major function: university, medical center, sports for the property owned by the leading soccer club of Turkey, and so on. We were eager to assure via planning and use management that this become authentically a town, and not revert to seasonal or dormitory use for Istanbul. The whole is linked by a looping public transit system, a kind of scaled-up version of the one in Penang, and allows for a 10-minute walk to transit, thus, we hope, mitigating the need for cars to circulate internally. In addition to the general planning, we did a somewhat more elaborate designs, one of them for one of the landowners, which we still have to build, this one here, for two of the villages, both located along the bounding river, that are intended to show the scale, character, mix, and harmonization strategies that we hope would give this town its special identity. And finally, equitable. This is the sine qua non. If urbanism does have a teleology, an intelligence behind its design, it must entail the facilitation of justice. Politics turns on equality as its principle, writes Jacques Rancière, and this is where, again, we begin. Mapping human relations at every scale, the city stands as both an incredibly succinct representation and a monumentally complex and efficient facilitator of contact, a distribution and collation engine. As the instrument of our manifold community, cities, unlike rainforests or rocket ships, are saturated with the political. Any claim to the contrary is disingenuous. Fairness and joy informs both known and not yet is the end of politics, the condition that gives meaning to the abstraction of an empty equity and insistently presses the demand of the beautiful on the town. Some years ago, we undertook a project for the design of a new Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, a place which, as you know, is one of the most contentious and weird on the globe. Jerusalem is cursed with a special kind of sprawl, which at the time we did the scheme included not simply the spread of the Israeli settlements, but an almost completely unregulated real estate boomlet in the Palestinian areas. This sprawl was having and continues to have extremely negative effects on the political and natural environments, both of which are extremely fragile. We began then with a growth boundary, insisting that whatever political arrangements were ultimately worked out, the Jerusalem conurbation was a single organism, and that its rather large existing extent, running from Bethlehem in the south to Ramallah in the north, was more than sufficient to satisfy any rational requirements for future growth. The comprehensive strategy then was for elaboration in place with a curb on any further lateral expansion. We then focused on a particular area, Wadi Jaws, a stream that had reverted to little more than a sewer. Its location next to the old city, however, was optimal, lying between the Palestinian east and the Israeli west. Our plan suggested that this area become a new central park for the city as a whole, a meeting ground for all of the city's inhabitants, and a symbol of a new spirit of equity. We placed the institutions of Palestinian governance to the north of the park, connected both to the old city and the historic Palestinian CBD. In addition, we proposed a kind of Olmstedian green necklace to wind its way through the much-neglected series of Palestinian neighborhoods that form the city's eastern edge. And now, in conclusion, for something completely different. As a final project, I'd like to show you some images of a hotel we've designed and hope to build soon in China. I cannot argue that this expensive and luxurious building has anything to do with equity or justice, or even that it advances the science of architectural sustainability very much. But it does allow me to return to an earlier point, as well as to reinforce my just-spoken ode to joy. Although I believe that the architectural profession has been beleaguered by a fetish for funny form, in which it seems every building is seeking to have its own Bilbao effect, I nonetheless want again to stress the idea that cities in the future will increasingly rely on artistic differences to establish the keys to their singularity. Equity defends the idea of individuality against a sea of indifferent homogeneity or intractably commercialized variety. The utopian city celebrates cooperation, but will always have room for flights of fancy, including fancy hotels. Thank you very much.
Absolutely delightful hour that was, I'm sure. Thank you, Professor Michael Sorkin. You'll have the opportunity shortly to catch up with Professor Sorkin and ask any questions. Thank you, Mr. Ross Nielson and the Honourable Andrew Fraser. Thank you all for coming, and please join us in the Poinciana Lounge. We're sure, actually, that you've enjoyed your evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.